Amazing grace,
Sweet,
how sweet the sound that saved a wretch like me. I once was lost, oh, but now I'm found. I was blind, but now I see.
twas grace that taught my heart to fear,
My heart to feel,
and
grace
my fears relieved. How precious did that grace appear,
that grace appear
in the hour I first believed.
And toils and snares that I have already come. It was grace
has
brought me safe this far.
Grace
will lead me
home.
When we have been there, 10,000 years,
10,000 years,
bright shining as the sun. We have no less days to sing God's praise than when we first begun.
The sound that
but now I'm fine. I was blind, but now I see.
I begin with our traditional opening for all of our events. We celebrate the source of all life and acknowledge the 7 directions: north, south, east, west, above, below, and within. And to the cycle of life of all African ancestored people, those who have gone on before, those living, and those yet to be born. Because they were, we are. Because we are, they will be. Our 2020 theme is Who Tells the Story? It is inspired by the African proverb, until the lion learns to write, tales of the hunt will always glorify the hunter. Our theme encourages us to research the authentic and overlooked voices of history, investigate those who have told their stories, and open space for each of us to be self-determined in telling our own story. You've tuned into the discussion on the film You Asked for the Facts about Robert Kennedy, Dixiecrat Governor Ross Barnett, and a revelation about the riots at the University of Mississippi. Hopefully you've screened the documentary You've Asked for the Facts on our festival site. It's up all week. And you will do so after this discussion if you want to learn more about some of the machinations behind this little-known moment in American history. Leading this discussion is CNN's Laura Jarrett. Laura, an attorney, covered the Justice Department and legal issues for CNN since 2016 and is now co-anchor of the daily morning news show, Early Start. We are thrilled to have Laura guide this conversation, and I will turn it over to her now to introduce our stellar panel. Laura?
Isasara, thank you so much for such a gracious introduction. I'm so pleased to be here for the March on Washington Film Festival, the 2020 Virtual Film Festival.
Yes.
Here with such an incredible panel of esteemed guests and to discuss such an important and thought-provoking film.
Okay, it's all yours.
Thank you. Who tells the story? The theme of this year's event is something I try to think about every day as a journalist at CNN, and specifically thinking about whose stories get uplifted, whose voices are amplified, and more often than not, whose voices are not heard enough, whose are diminished. It's a subject that's at the thrust of this documentary. You asked for the facts, and I'm so looking forward to discussing it with all of our panelists. I know everyone's eager to hear from our terrific panel, so let me just briefly introduce who we've got on the line here, starting with Gerald Blessey.
Hi, Laura.
Gerald Blessey has worn many hats in his life, but since his college days at the University of Mississippi in the 1960s, civil rights has been at the core of his work. After graduating from law school from UM in 1966, Gerald Blessey taught at the law school, served in Vietnam, and was eventually elected to the Mississippi House of Representatives back in 1972. He later served as the mayor of Biloxi, Mississippi for roughly 8 years, a force behind a plan to revive the city's economy by redeveloping the historic waterfront. And he continues his private practice of law today in Biloxi. Next up, we have Lisa Osborne Ross. Lisa.
Hey there, Laura, Gerald, good to be here. It's an honor to be with all of these storytellers. So thank you for having me.
Thanks so much for joining us, Lisa. She's the U.S. Chief Operating Officer of Edelman in Washington, D.C., and leads the office as the president of Edelman as well. With a passion for empowering women and building more diversity and inclusion within the corporate world, Ross is also a government veteran, serving in multiple roles within the Clinton administration. She was named as one of Savoy Magazine's most influential women in corporate America in 2019 and has received many awards for all of her important work. And we are so happy to have her here with us. Up next is Kerry Kennedy.
Hi there.
Kerry Kennedy is a human rights advocate, lawyer, mother, New York Times best-selling author, and of course, the daughter of Robert and Ethel Kennedy. Kerry has devoted more than 40 years in the pursuit of justice and is the president of the Robert F. Kennedy Human Rights, a nonprofit advocacy organization. In her book, Ripples of Hope, Kennedy writes of her father's lasting impact, his sense of compassion for those who are suffering, his vision for a country that addresses systemic injustices, all themes in the film that we're going to explore more this evening. And we're so pleased to have her here. And finally, our filmmaker, Mary Blessy.
Hi, thank you for having me.
Mary, the director of our film today, is a documentary filmmaker and producer. She's, of course, the daughter of Gerald Blessey with us here today, and Paige Gutierrez. Mary was born and raised in Mississippi, earned her BA from Millsap College, and her MA and MFA at the University of Mississippi at Oxford, focusing on documentary studies and investigating the history and the rich culture of the American South. She founded Holly Street Media, her film production company, back in 2017. So that is our wonderful panel this evening. All of you, of course, have seen Mary's film and in some cases lived the events that are covered in Mary's film, but I want to set out some context for our audience here just briefly to preview what we're about to discuss tonight. So the film surrounds an incredibly important junction in this nation's history beginning in 1962, as James Meredith is about to set out to be the first African-American enrolled at the University of Mississippi, and President Kennedy is weighing whether to send in federal troops to keep him safe. The film details a series of behind-the-scenes calls unknown to the public at the time between then Attorney General Bobby Kennedy and the governor of Mississippi, Ross Barnett, in 1962 about Meredith's enrollment at the school and about how to get him actually in the doors. The details of those calls, which we're going to delve into together, are ultimately revealed in a highly anticipated speech by Senator Kennedy at the University of Mississippi 4 years later in 1966, as Barnett is running for re-election as governor. How big of an impact those calls had on Barnett's failed re-election bid is an interesting political question, but what's clear is that they showed that he wasn't exactly the man that he had made himself out to be, at least to the voters of Mississippi. So I'd like to kick things off here tonight with Mary, our filmmaker. If we could bring up Mary. So Mary, first to you, I would just love to know, how did this film come to be? What inspired you to tell this story?
First of all, thank you again, Laura, for having me. I'm honored, humbled, and excited to be here. This film, the film topic, of course, I've heard a little bit about it growing up, but I knew that it was a story most people were not as familiar with. And I was struck when we started the film. We actually started some of the first interviews all the way back in 2017. So some of the principal interviews you see in the film are actually from 2017, 2018, and it's remarkable to me just how they have continued to become more and more relevant, right? These issues have become more and more relevant. So that's really what I was struck by, the links to the present, demagoguery, leaders lying, disinformation, all of these things that we're going to get into here. So I just wanted to revisit that history. We can't revisit that history enough. We need to reckon with that history. So I just thought it was a compelling story, past and present.
Well, that's certainly true. It could not be more timely at this period in our nation's history. That was true back in 2017 when you were doing the interviews, and it could not be more true now in 2020 as we are in the midst of an election season like no other. So I'd like to start at the beginning of the film, if we could, and just bring up Gerald Blessey, if we have that ability, and go back to 1962, setting the stage with the integration of the University of Mississippi by James Meredith. And Gerald, I would love for you to sort of set the stage for our audience and describe what campus was like back then as a student.
Well, I was an undergraduate in '62, a junior. The campus, of course, the lead up to James Meredith coming in '62 had been going on for several years in the courts. And the beginning of that year, '62, there was a lot of tension. Keep in mind, the context of the times is that civil rights was the main issue going on in Mississippi and around the nation. And also the Cold War was going on. The Cuban Missile Crisis was a few weeks after this. So there's a lot of tension. There's a broad spectrum of opinion on the campus. A lot of different students. Interesting that in 1960, when I was a freshman, I co-chaired the campus campaign for President Kennedy. He actually got a plurality of the votes. Nixon was second, and Ross Barnett came third. Just to give you an idea, there's a wide spectrum. Of course, most of them are pretty conservative students. But the student government, I was part of the student government at that time as a junior. The student government had tried to reason with the segregationist white supremacist leaders, Barnett and all of them, about, leave us alone and let us peacefully integrate. That's the right thing to do, the constitutional thing. But the students were the only adults in the room. We couldn't get them to pay attention. So it was an exciting time. Fast forward to 1966, 4 more years of the same kind of struggles going on, intensified, of course. By then, we had Freedom Summer in 1964, and great young leaders like Bob Moses and John Lewis were in Mississippi, created the Freedom Summer, but violence was the backdrop. We had murders in the Freedom Summer 3 in Philadelphia. Just in 1966, just 3 months before Senator Kennedy came, Vernon Damon had been assassinated in Hattiesburg, one of the great civil rights leaders of Mississippi. We're doing the voting rights thing. So the atmosphere was tense, to say the least, but it was, all the other trappings of college life going on. It was an exciting time. There was no way we couldn't avoid the passion and action of our time. We were involved in it,
So as a student, Gerald, you were obviously involved with the Young Democrats on campus. You meet someone named Cleveland Donald, and it turns out he has a pretty important connection to Kennedy's office. And somehow, I won't get into how his sourcing worked out. I don't want to make presumptions about that, but he finds out about these then private phone calls between the Attorney General, Bobby Kennedy, and the governor. And Cleveland tells you about these phone calls. So tell us, what was that like?
Well, Cleveland and I had met as Young Democrats. He was the second African-American. The late Cleveland Donald, my dear friend, passed away a few years ago. But so we met at Young Democrats meetings. He was actually co-chair with Harding Carter III of the statewide Young Democrats. And we were talking about Osborne getting ready to run for governor again in 67. This is in 65 we're talking about it, but campaigns were beginning. And Cleveland had mentioned that he had learned that there were actual tapes of the conversations. We had heard rumors that there had been conversations, but the press in Mississippi, it was a closed society, as Professor Silver said. The local press would not report those kind of things. And of course, Ross Barnett was lying still, even in 66, that nothing had ever happened. So when Cleveland mentioned this, we got to talking, said if we could only reveal the truth about those phone calls, then Barnett would be exposed as a hypocrite and a liar, and maybe we could prevent him from becoming elected again. It was a time for action, and we'd thought about, for instance, writing an article, Cleveland and I, but we felt, who would believe us? And the segregation leadership, would not. We needed a live witness, and the only person on those phone calls still living, the president had been assassinated. Robert Kennedy was the only one who would tell the truth about what happened.
That's interesting, because when I first, saw and read about this, I thought immediately, like, gosh, I would love to have been on the receiving end of the news about those calls and break that news. And I wondered whether you had considered going to the press with it. So it's interesting to hear that you had considered actually writing an article about it, but you felt like, again, to the issue of who tells the story, you thought that Kennedy obviously would have a certain level of credibility to be able to deliver that news.
The other part, Laura, is, a live event can't be denied. And the leadership of Mississippi was just denying everything about the truth of the civil rights struggles. And so ultimately we had 6,000 witnesses that heard this, mostly students. And by that time it went out among us that they couldn't deny it any longer. So the value of live statements is so important.
So I want to bring Kerry Kennedy into this discussion a bit, because Kerry, you were obviously only a little girl at the time of these secret conversations, but I assume at some point you learned the history of what happened at the University of Mississippi. Obviously, your father has a rich history in many different civil rights moments and other moments. But when you learned about this particular sort of background negotiations with Governor Barnett, how surprised were you?
Well, I think, President Kennedy and my father were really struggling to make sure that the Supreme Court orders were complied with, and that there wasn't huge violence across our country. And that's really what their main concerns were. So I'm not really surprised. I mean, I don't think I was surprised at all to learn that President Kennedy and my father as Attorney General were having private discussions with Ross Barnett, as they were with George Wallace and with others. Of course, they were having discussions all the time with everybody who was involved, and they had discussions with Martin Luther King and John Lewis, et cetera. I mean, they were right in the midst of this, the civil rights movement, trying to create change in our country, trying to dismantle the violence against Black people that is such a part of our history. And so that took a lot of negotiations with a lot of unsavory characters and a lot of people they considered heroes.
I have to tell you, I was struck as well about how much Robert Kennedy was focused on this idea of what he calls law and order. And you hear that phrase thrown around a lot right now in such a different way. And Dad keeps saying over and over again, we have to maintain law and order. What I think he means in that context is, like, I'm not going to put James Meredith in harm's way. I'm not going to put anyone else in harm's way. And part of the reason, at least according to the transcripts that I've read and that we see in Mary's film, is he does not want a standoff because he's worried somebody is going to get hurt.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And, Barnett was suggesting that the federal troops pull out their guns and point them at people, which really would have been a disaster. I mean, can you imagine? At the same time, Ross Barnett was instigating a mob and calling for white supremacists across the state to gather in Oxford in order to stop Meredith from being able to register there. So he was just an unsavory character. His first concern was to make sure that the federal law would not be complied with. And then his real concern was his own political survival. And he was not a patriot. He was a man who was just obsessed with power and was willing to put people's lives at stake in order to maintain its own power.
One of the most striking scenes in Mary's film, at least for me, and Gerald describes this well, is Barnett's at the football game and he's holding this rally, holding court, and just like the cheers and all the Confederate flags. I mean, we see political rallies today, and it felt like that. It's kind of amazing to see the parallels between then and now. Lisa, I want to get your thoughts on this, because back in '62, when the calls between Kennedy and Barnett are taking place, the public has no clue about what's going on. Barnett is going to be held in contempt by a federal court. And so Meredith eventually enrolls in the University of Mississippi. And instead, the narrative in the local press is on the side of the segregationists. And Mary does a really nice job of showing clips, news clippings of what the press, the presumably objective press, was saying at the time. It wasn't just opinion columnists, it was the straight up news and what they were saying. And the situation is described in the film by journalist Ellen Meacham as a miscalculation on Kennedy's part for not realizing how resistant the Mississippi legislature or leadership would be about the situation with Meredith. And I'm interested, in your perspective, with all of your experience in government, did you see it that way? Did you agree with her? It's a miscalculation on Kennedy's part?
Laura, before I answer that question, I have to go back to a couple of things that you've said in this conversation. And because the reason we go back is to inform our future and to improve our future. And the synergies between now and then are stark and frightening and disheartening in many ways. And you talked about many of them, but one, this concept of light and truth, and then truth having to be the victor and the importance of facts. Two, media manipulation. We saw it then and we see it now in terms of the responsibility of storytellers to be clean and to be agenda free. Three, we haven't talked about this, but I was struck in the film about the definition of who's a person and who's a citizen. And it was dark and it was limited. And it was not inclusive, and people believed it when they said, we're doing this for our people, but it was like, but we're people too, but not in your eyes. And so we see this again now as we talk about who's right, who's valuable. It brings in our issues about immigration, et cetera. And then lastly, this use of staging for political amplification. Like this was theater. It didn't work, but this was theater. So to answer your question, with all of that top of mind, I don't think it was a miscalculation. I think it was a very clear misunderstanding of culture. These were two, you could tell in the tapes where the president and as the general, as the governor kept calling him, but the attorney general, they were people who saw the world this way. And the governor was a person who saw the world this way. So miscalculation, maybe not, complete misunderstanding of culture and almost of tribes. And I think that that's what manifests itself in this entire endeavor.
Yeah, certainly the public spectacle surrounding all of it is just fascinating. How much sort of stagecraft that wanted to do with Kennedy that comes through the transcripts. I mean, they're not even holding back at all. He's saying straight up why he needs them to come in with their guns and why then he'll step away. I mean, he wants to go through.
He was a director. He was directing this as though he was doing a stage play. It was remarkable.
Yeah, but he so clearly had an image in his mind.
Right.
He thought the public was expecting of him as well.
Yes, that's absolutely right. And I think we see that now, the control of image and the control of brand. So the governor had a brand, and he wanted to make sure that his brand remained untouched and actually was intensified in this process, which is why he crafted or attempted to craft how he would be perceived for the audiences that were important to him. And again, we see it every day in the work that we're watching as we prepare for this election cycle. But if he was protecting his brand, and he thought he had a good brand, I think we know he didn't.
Well, it worked for him for a while.
For a while. And all good things, things happen for a while, but at the end of the day, it backfires. And I think this is exactly what we saw here.
Mary, I want to get your thoughts on how you decided to include the pieces of the transcripts that you did, because I thought it was interesting how you clipped them together, how you decided which news articles sort of overlay, and sort of the interesting interviews that you had from professors on campus. And obviously you had James Meredith there, the subject of the integration. But specifically, how did you decide which transcripts and which interactions between Kennedy and Barnett to include? Because there were a bunch of different phone calls and transcripts that I've read. So how did you pick out what you thought conveyed the importance of this interaction?
Yeah. Well, first of all, I want to speak briefly to Ms. Ross's point. I agree. I think from my longer talks with Ellen Meacham in the film, I kind of got the sense that she was conveying sort of what you just did in what she was more conveying. They learned a lot from this event. Of course, they had the integration of the University of Alabama the following year. I think they learned a lot about this difference of culture and that what it would take to use the full force of the federal government to do what's right. And so they were kind of forged in fire and then learned, and then they weren't messing around the next year, So I think it was more in looking at the evolution, of course, and looking at Bobby Kennedy's evolution over the years, being open to learning and the strategic thinker that he was. So that's kind of how I interpreted that. But to your question, Laura, how did I choose which parts of the transcripts? Well, first of all, there's over 20 phone calls. There's a lot of Ross Barnett showing who he is, and it's on tape. And I really wanted to select the parts I selected for the film, just the parts where he is really indicting himself. I mean, he is literally saying to the president and to Attorney General Robert Kennedy, I'm on the spot here. I mean, it's horrible what he's trying to do in the first place, obviously. Then on top of that, he's a coward and a liar, right? And he's behind the scenes capitulating. He's saying, I'm going to cooperate. That's on the lines, we got in there. And then it all culminates, and this was really how I tried to edit that scene together, was culminating in this part where he really, really indicts himself. He says, I got to stand strong, blah, 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 but that's just to Mississippi people. And then, as you mentioned, the main press outlets at the time, of course, you didn't have the internet, so forth. you had mainly the Clarion Ledger, owned by the Heddermans, out of Jackson. They were known to be a very strong segregationist, white supremacist family controlling this newspaper. They were in collaboration with Barnett, so this is all going behind the scenes. And this is kind of what they're talking about earlier with Cleveland Donald. They just knew with the state of the press how it was, with the way Barnett spins everything, his propaganda, he's going to deny it. We've got to get this revealed live because the press is going to do just what they did in the headline from the Clarion Ledger that I put up at the same time, right after he says in the phone call, "Oh, that's just Mississippi people." There's a headline in the Clarion Ledger that says, "Governor keeps his word to citizens." Right? So it's right there. And again, kind of sounds familiar, right? So it's this has been going on for a long time, but I wanted to show, we can't, one of our defenses obviously against leaders who lie like this is to just show the evidence, right? Play the tape.
Play the tape. I want to fast forward, if we could, and bring in Gerald. Fast forward to 1966. Barnett's back at it. And Gerald, you and your colleagues hatched something of a brilliant plan. Kennedy is now a U.S. Senator from New York, and you and your colleagues are thinking through how to get these phone calls out, as you've already mentioned. Talk to us, describe your thought process for how you wanted to strategize to best get this information out. Because what's so clear and so nicely laid out in Mary's film is that Kennedy was really resistant to the idea of throwing Barnett under the bus.
Right. Well, first of all, keep in mind we had to get around the speaker ban to begin with, and that's well told in the story. But and so the strategy was we would ask people to come speak about general topics of the day. We had a long list, mostly conservatives. I mean, we had everything from the John Birch Society to others, and then Robert Kennedy on the list for the chancellor to approve. But we were hoping he would just reveal everything in his main speech, and it wasn't until Cleveland went and spoke to him in D.C. to say, "We've got this invitation coming from you," and by that time, we thought we'd been approved by the chancellor, but the firestorm hadn't happened yet. But the senator made it clear, and he was absolutely correct, of course, being wiser politically, that it wasn't his place to come attack. I mean, if you want to hear the truth, then invite me and ask me questions. And it's clear that I'm answering your questions because you want to know, you the students and the people of Mississippi want to know. And he said that would be the appropriate way. And he even stressed, make it clear that really, if you look at his whole speech, I wish you could, it's available, the whole main speech. I mean, he was appealing to unification, to the better angel of everybody, both in Mississippi and in the country. I mean, he was talking about the things that can unite us, but he was unequivocal about civil rights. I mean, this is the first major speaker that I saw up to that time in my life in Mississippi that would act other than the civil rights leaders. I'm talking about the first political leader to come and actually say, this is the new day, and trying to awaken the students. And many of them were awakened by this revelation, but also by the courage of him coming and speaking the truth. So it was, I think Kennedy's reaction to our request was absolutely correct. And that's why we set it up so that Frank Thaxton and Ed Ellington, no one else was going to get a question in until we got the question.
How much did you have to twist his arm? I mean, how long did these kind of back and forth negotiations with him and his office take?
Well, there wasn't really any twisting of arms. I think Cleveland acknowledged when the senator suggested, look, I'll come down, and I'll answer questions, but I'm not going to attack anybody. I'll talk about what are the issues of the day, as he did. He talked about the Cold War, he talked about the Vietnam War. He was asked questions, but so when Cleveland came back, I mean, we said, okay, he said immediately, well, that's what we'll do, Senator. And when he came back, then we had to figure out how to make that happen. And of course, we had already decided to have a law school speakers bureau that we created and picked the members and picked the chairman at Ellington and picked the questioners and so forth. And there was an understanding throughout most of the law school of what we were doing, because everybody wanted to know the answer to these questions and hear it from a true witness, the only witness, Robert Kennedy. So, the question was asked 3 times. Frank actually acknowledges it. So he had to lead up to it. The first question, of course, was part of, by that time, the senator had charmed the audience, as you can see from a lot of people came not knowing what to expect. And they were so, when the senator and Ethel walked out on the stage holding hands, I'm telling you, it was like melting the audience. And so they were following, the major speech very well, and congratulations on the standing ovation. But when he talked about that question is an interesting question, and then he said, asked me something you've heard about me, and I'll tell you the truth. By that time, he had the audience realize that this is a genuinely honest, truthful person who cares about us. He was here, he was respecting the fact that students wanted to hear him, and they showed that respect in return.
I gotta say, if I had been in the audience, I would have been on the edge of my seat, because you can tell he's about to do something. You don't quite know where it's going. Obviously, you guys did, because you knew what was actually behind it and everything that had gone on those calls. But I can just imagine being there and feeling like, oh, this is a big moment. Kerry, I want to get your thoughts on this, because as Gerald so nicely laid out, your dad was very careful with how he wanted this question posed, how he was going to answer it. He made the student, Frank, I think his name is, press him 3 times. He didn't want it to look as if he was too quick to offer up this information. What did you make of all that?
There was a mention of my father's evolution, and I think that he did in fact learn a lot from what happened at the University of Mississippi, which he then used for the University of Alabama the following year. And he that made a film called Crisis, which I highly recommend. It's kind of a companion film to this film. And he wanted those negotiations that were on the phone and secretive with Ross Barnett. He wanted those to be out in the open when he did them with George Wallace. So my dad, and there's a filmmaker with Uncle Jack in the White House having those negotiations. And that's one of the things he learned, that the American people need to understand how these changes happen, what the negotiations are, and how we can move forward as a country through transparency, not through cover-ups.
Kerry, I'm going to let you refresh your browser very briefly, and let's bring in Mary here. Mary, I'm curious how you decided to have the students be the storyteller. Obviously, your dad plays a huge integral role in getting Kennedy campus, all of the background negotiations between his team and the students. But I found it was so interesting to hear their perspective here instead of having, so a professor talk about it. How did you decide to really let the students be the storytellers?
Well, there are a couple of professors in the film who do kind of chime in and give more historical analysis, but it is rooted in the experience of these students. For one thing, they are, in terms of the central plot of Cleveland Donald going to Washington, D.C., they're going to get Bobby Kennedy to come down. They're going to plant Frank Baxter in the audience, have him ask the question 3 times. That, to me, that was so at the crux of understanding this backstory and the optics and that strategy and everything. And the only people living who can speak on it, are these students. Cleveland Donald is unfortunately deceased. Of course, Bobby Kennedy is no longer with us. So when you hear from Ed Ellington, when you hear from Frank Baxter, when you hear from my father, when you hear people who were there at the time, like journalist Curtis Wilkie and I just really believe in the value of eyewitness accounts and especially the emotional impact that brings as well. You know, when you're thinking about putting a film together, you could have just only professors and historians, but I want to hear from the people who were there. And so it's important to have those students, not just the students who were involved in the planning of it, of course, but there are some students interviewed in the film who were just in the audience, you know, speaking from their perspective. Ruben Anderson, who was the first Black graduate of the University of Mississippi School of Law, speaks from his perspective, being there as a law student at the time, as sitting in the audience. Several others. This film, this story is centered around young people and what are they thinking sitting in that audience. And also kind of the audience is sort of a character in the film in many ways, not only in that room, but if you think about what Ross Barnett is doing, what he's doing at the football game, what's going on with the audience there. He's trying to kind of fake this photo op, saying one thing and doing another. That has a very specific audience in mind. Even to call back what was being talked about earlier about Law and Order. Well, you know, the Kennedys are talking on the phone. They don't want anybody getting hurt. They're trying to protect Meredith and, you know, actual Law and Order. But when Ross Barnett and his ilk are talking about Law and Order, they're not talking about Law and Order for everybody, right? That's code for a certain audience, right? So there's always an audience in mind, and that can be used for good or bad, good, bad, neutral, I suppose. But Robert Kennedy is a great performer and a great strategist and courageous, and he comes before this audience and he knows how to work that audience. And then I wanted to hear from people in that audience. What did they think? They were young. They were being exposed to something that they had not been able to hear much in Mississippi, precisely because the powers that be did not want them to hear that kind of thing in Mississippi, right? So yeah, it was important to hear what they thought sitting in that audience.
So speaking of how he worked the audience, Lisa, I want to get your opinion here on Kennedy's strategy and how he wanted this information revealed in my mind in such a careful way. He didn't want to seem too aggressive, as we've mentioned, but he also clearly wanted the information out there. And it's so interesting, you know, today, I can't imagine this holding as long as it did. He kept the confidence of Barnett for a long time, even though obviously people, you know, speculated about the negotiations. There was lots of rumors about that, but the actual meat of it and what came out, he really laid out in, you know, a way as only he could, as Gerald said. So once the news was out there, how much would the public at that time be moved by something like that? Obviously, there's, you know, thousands of people in the audience. He knows the press is going to go crazy with this as soon as he says it. Kennedy does. How would that have been received at the time?
I think what Robert Kennedy did is something that we advise our clients to do all the time. He was so himself. He was so himself. We talk so much. I think authenticity is like the most overused word in the American public right now, but he was truly himself. And by being himself, that's how he won them over. And I think if you look on the other side, whether you liked Bobby Kennedy or not, he was true to himself. He said what he believed. He presented himself in a manner that was, yes, of course, charming, but you've seen politicians when they're with one crowd, they sound one way and they dress one way and they look some way, and all of us sort of code switch. He didn't code switch. He was like, this is who I am, and I'm comfortable with who I am, and I'm going to stand that up. And I have enough confidence that being who I am will bring people together and enlighten them that there are other ways of looking at world issues. So I thought that was the most strategic, powerful thing that he did. And conversely, I think what eventually hurt the governor was, you know, it's almost like if you're going to be a segregationist, be a real segregationist. You know, be a true segregationist. You know, I may not like who you are, but I expect you to be true to yourself. And the tapes revealed that he wasn't. The tapes revealed that it was theater. And I thought one of the most magnificent things that Mary did in this film, if you recall, when the Attorney General was speaking, you could hear the laughter, but when she puts the camera, when you go around and she shows some of the faces, and some of those folks were crestfallen. They were crestfallen. And so for me, the auditory and the visual aspects of it went like this. You heard laughter, but the faces, people were disappointed because they realized they had been lied to. They realized that they had been led to believe that he was this great segregationist, or he believed what he was saying, and it wasn't true at all. It was like finding out that Santa Claus wasn't real. They were crestfallen. And so I thought that was the most interesting thing. And I think Bobby Kennedy's strategy was to be himself. And when you are yourself, you rarely lose. You rarely lose.
So to your point, what kind of impact do you think that this truth-telling session had on the public's trust? You know, if they're crestfallen, they've had this image of a man that is not founded in fact. How do we as consumers of news and those who are expected to rely on our public officials for truth separate out this fact from fiction?
Trust is everything. Laura, you know this from the work that you do. Everyone on this panel knows that the fundamental basis for any true relationship is, do I trust you? It's not, do I like you? It's not, do I agree with you? It's not, do I believe in you? It is, do I trust you? And that's where I think the governor made the most significant, life-changing, as we can see, mistake, is because there was a breach of trust with who he presented himself to be and then who he actually was. And it was done in a huge way. And then the person you end up sort of trusting is this Yankee that you've been led to believe had horns and a tail and was out to ruin your way of life. And then this man walks in and he is one of you. And again, they may not have agreed with him, they may not have liked him, but he spoke the truth, and he did it in such a way that he maintained his dignity, and he sought to maintain the dignity of the governor, but there was no dignity to be maintained. But I thought he did his best to bring dignity to the entire situation.
Watching it, I wondered whether in today's environment he would have been believed. You know, at the time, Kennedy has such gravitas and credibility that what he said was seen as objective truth, and that he wasn't lying about their conversations. I wonder today whether people would say it's fake.
We are so tribalized right now. I think it's the thing that is so upsetting about our political system now, that you seem to have on a red jacket. I think it's red. But in our environment, if I am predisposed to believe it's blue, I'm going to think it's blue. And so you raise a really, really good point that, I think we almost had more purity then. I know that feels really hard to say that there might have been more purity then, but we are so tribalized and we're so conditioned to believe what we are told to believe that is in our comfort zone. We very often cannot see beyond that. And so I think you raise a really good point. I'm going to go with you have on a red blazer. But right now, if I were one of those people, if I was told to believe that it was blue, right now I would say it's blue. And it's a tricky, dangerous place to be in. It's a tricky, dangerous place to be in.
Well said. Gerald, I want to get your quick thoughts here. I know it was described as a life-changing event for some of those in the audience. Tell us about that.
Well, Lisa hit the nail on the head. I mean, it was many of the students had come not knowing what to expect, and what they got for the first time in their lives was an authentic, real leader, a unifier who was telling them the truth, but in a way that was, explaining to them that things can be better, and so that was part of the response. Now, I think even to this day, I run into people who were there, and I know there's another justice of the Mississippi Supreme Court who was a colleague of Reuben, who was a young law student at the time, a very conservative person. And he literally told me it changed his life, among many others. And he then followed, he's a liberal Democrat now. I mean, this is a white person. And that was not isolated. I mean, there were a lot of people, no one had been telling them the truth. And here's somebody who obviously is being authentically truthful. And it was just so refreshing and heartwarming. And they were happy. It was a happy crowd. I mean, a couple of people in the audience that Mary filmed were just students, and they talked about how good a feeling it was and how cheerful and happy they were about this. And to Lisa's point, by the way, I mean, I think what we don't have enough today is leaders like Robert Kennedy, who will, do the hard thing, tell the truth everywhere, same story, stand up for what's right, and don't give up. I mean, you've got a lot of unelected leaders out there that are doing this right now, but not many in office. And let's see what happens.
Kerry, I want to get you back in the mix here on this strategy point and on your dad as the truth teller in this situation and how much his word was trusted. What do you make of his strategy and how he laid it out and how it was received?
I think that's just, he was being who he was. He was genuine, and one of his best friends said that you could wrap up Bobby Kennedy's entire life in the phrase, "Get your foot off his neck." And that's really what my father did his entire life, from high school, stopping bullies, to college, to law school. He was invited the first African-American person to speak at the University of Virginia Law School, and integrated the school for the first time in terms of public speakers. So that's who he was. That's what he did his whole life, and this was not going to be an exception. So I think he felt comfortable in his skin, telling the truth to people. He did that in South Africa. He did it all over our country.
It certainly resonated with folks. Gerald mentioned that the moment he and your mom, Ethel, walk out on stage, it sort of just changed the whole vibe. And your mom describes being there in the room, and at first she says she felt a little bit apprehensive. What did you make of the impact of him bringing Ethel Kennedy with him?
Well, I mean, I think that they just love to be together. And so, I think it was.
I asked that because I wonder if it speaks to the trust factor. It's something about it. They were there. They're eating with the students. They're sort of carousing like a normal couple.
Yeah. Well, I mean, that's kind of the way they rolled. Again, in South Africa, they went to, sort of the Stellenbosch University, which is the heart of apartheid thought leadership. And again, they were there together and spoke and sat with all the students. And I think in the dining hall, and my father was incredibly courageous and was always finding ways to overcome his physical fears. But my mother she was highly competitive, but also had more of a wariness of walking into hostile environments. And I think that they bolstered one another. And I think that being able to see that my father was not a monster, had a wife, had 11 children, was a real human being, and would speak truth to power, was something that gained him enormous respect with people. And he had a sense of humor about himself and about everybody else, and and he was lovable. So I think that really made a big difference.
I saw it as a humanizing move to have him bring her. Although I'm sure they love just being together as well. It to me sent a signal to everyone that.
Yeah, I think that's true. But anybody who's met my mother would never confuse her with a prop, and and I don't think that would have been part of the calculation. Although I think that it's nice that it worked out that way.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. And Gerald, just to kind of round out the discussion here, for the African American students who were in the room, we heard from some of them in the film, like Justice Reuben Anderson. I can only imagine how validating Robert Kennedy's revelations must have been. Did you talk to anyone at the time who sort of articulated what that was like?
Well, yes, especially Cleveland Donald. Of course, he was overjoyed, and the senator had requested that not only the main speech, but he had a special speech with the Young Democrats and the Catholic students, the Newman Club, and a lot of off-campus African American Young Democrats were invited along with. At any rate, we didn't have enough African American students then. Reuben was one of three of the first group of four law students, but all of them to a person were just overjoyed that this had happened the way we wanted it to happen, which was to not only reveal the hypocrisy of Ross Barnett, but for the student body to see that the kind of leadership that we were supporting, Robert Kennedy and the whole civil rights movement were believable, and they were wonderful, and they were human beings, like Kerry was saying. I mean, it was just a wonderful experience. And by the way, to the point about trust, I do think for the audience, the fact that Kennedy and Mrs. Kennedy had the courage and the decency to come together and say, we're family just like you. Let's work on the future. Let's do what's right. I mean, it really was a life-changing moment for many. And the African-American students were then sort of, yes, validated, but also encouraged that, we got a long way to go, and we still do. But there are some who will respond when you appeal to the better angels.
Well put. Well, we're in the midst of a presidential election season that I would be remiss if I didn't talk about, given this film and all of the things it lays out. There's just so many parallels we could get into, but one of them is, I think, the issue of framing. And Lisa, if we could bring you up, it's clear to me that President Trump wants to trigger reaction within his core base of supporters about violence overtaking large American cities that happen to be run by Democratic mayors and governors in this election season. And he's, as we've mentioned, drawn on themes of what he calls law and order, although I question who law and order applies to in his scheme. And I just drawing on what we saw in this film, especially at the end with Kennedy providing these revelations to the public and really performing a public service and giving the voters information about Ross Barnett, and he's ultimately defeated. And you have to, think that this had some part in that. What do you think one of the lessons or some of the lessons we might draw from this film when it comes to the current election?
I think it's the role of media. President Trump can't frame anything unless someone is showing something. And who do we rely on? People like you, which is why it's so important to have responsible journalists who are storytellers. Let's end where we started, the importance of storytelling. And you have to have people who are honest about the storytelling, who are agenda free about the storytelling. And in one of the clips that in Mary's movie, there's this piece in one of the papers about senseless law and order, senseless outburst of violence. And you see it right now, but you would not actually see these things if media were not covering it. You know, we talked a lot about trust. You know, we do this trust barometer at Edelman, and we've been doing a lot of research on racial equity in the aftermath of the murder of George Floyd. And the research that we're going to release next week talks about the role of media and how the American public is looking at media and is frustrated, disappointed, and not trustful because they believe that media is highlighting the violence, that media is being unbalanced and unfair in their coverage of the protest. And so the storytelling is the most important piece of it. And Donald Trump may try to tell his story, but he doesn't have the vehicle and the mechanism to visualize. And that's the role that media plays. And so, Laura, for people like you, to drive responsible journalism, to drive, I've said it before, agenda-free journalism, that is the job and that is the trust that we as citizens put in our media. The last thing I have to say, because it so moved me, the pictures of the Black men that were in Mary's film. My parents are of that generation. They are Black Southerners, but who were HBCU grads. And I know that these movements meant everything to them. And I know that the bravery of people like Gerald and obviously the Kennedys, but the everyday people like the students made all the difference in the world. And I know that my parents and the generations that have followed are grateful for that.
I want to follow this theme with each of you, just as I think it's so timely and doesn't apply to just one candidate or one party. Obviously, Kerry, we could bring you in on this as well. What do you think Mary's film teaches us about each of us as consumers of stories about our public officials and storytellers for people like Mary and myself, obviously? But what do you think that the film tells us about how we should understand what's happening in this current environment?
I mean, I think our country is a country that is a little bit schizophrenic in our history. And we're always torn between the side of us that is based on fear and hatred and says, batten down the hatches, don't let in immigrants, everybody's your enemy. The only way to make it is to grab everything for yourself. And another side, which is open and loving and peace-seeking and open to the world, and values every human being and their dignity. And I would just be, I think that if we reach into our heart of hearts, we know who we want to be and we know what kind of world we want to build for our children. And so I would say, think about the messages you're hearing and go with the messages that appeal to the best in you and and then anything else that doesn't sound like that, I'd be very, very skeptical of the truth of what they're saying, because it doesn't really sound true in the end. In your heart, in your soul, just doesn't sound right. So I'd be skeptical of those voices.
Gerald, how do you see it? How do you read this film? How do you think it teaches us something about our current environment?
Well, if you look at our history, I mean, demagoguery has been with us a long time and will continue to be with us a long time. But as Kerry was saying, we need to listen to positive voices that are out there and really support that kind of leadership it's the everyday citizens. It's not just the national leaders. It's all the way down to the community level. And the story, every generation has to deal with this. I would defer to Mary really because, I think the impact is the storytellers must be heard, but the content of the story is what's all important. And I'm optimistic that these issues can be overcome, even though we're somewhat polarized now. Yes, but it's a new age, and I'm really encouraged that the younger generation can move us forward.
Well, Mary, you're the final word here. As our filmmaker of such an important work, what do you hope people will take away from it, and what they can apply to holding their public officials accountable today?
Yeah, I think first of all, one of the main takeaways is, this is nothing new, right? There's nothing new under the sun. And I think it helps my generation to watch films, read books, whatever it is, see these stories. It's actually, in a way, empowering to see that it's happened before. It's disappointing to see that it's a pattern, but it's empowering to understand the pattern, because maybe if you understand it, you can do something about it. So, the takeaway is, demagogues have been around for a long time, and they always kind of play from the same playbook. They are invested in convincing you there is a problem that's not actually a problem, then positioning themselves as the only person who can solve that problem. Disinformation, propaganda, so forth. So we know how to deal with this. We have to come together and refuse to be gaslighted. And one of the ways that you do that and you hold on to reality is you have documents, you have documentaries, you have documents, you have evidence, right? And to stay vigilant. I think the takeaway is this is the last time to check out, right? This is not the time to get jaded. We've done this before. We've got to keep up the work and just keep holding on to what we know is the evidence.
I think that's a great note to end on. Don't check out. There's so much at stake for all of us right now. And I want to thank you guys. I could talk to you guys for hours. You've been such a great and diverse group with so many interesting perspectives. And I want to encourage everyone in our audience to tell their friends to see this film. There's so much rich history there. And as all of the panelists have explained, there's so much that can apply to our lives today. So I want to thank you all. It's so great to see you and to do this, and send it back to ISSR now.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Laura. And to all of our panelists, and to all of you for joining us, and to all of these speakers for illuminating this important chapter in our nation's history. So to all of our visitors and friends to the festival, be sure to check out all of the many films on our festival schedule, including the finalist short films in our student and emerging filmmaker competition. We received scores of entries from 14 different countries on this subject of what's your civil right. And so be sure to view them and all of our festival offerings. And until I see you again, march on.
Yeah.